minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Business for Peace webinar on testing innovative social impact measurement by businesses in complex contexts. My name is Maya Ragab. I'm a coordinator at the UN Prime Working Group on Business for Peace. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us today. Just a reminder that this event is recorded, so you will find it along with our previous events on our website, unprime-b4p.org. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit it within the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and the panelists will try to respond to as much as possible throughout at the end of the webinar too. So before we go ahead with today's discussion, let me turn the floor over to the moderator of this session and the chair of our working group, Dr. Christina Veitch, who will tell you more about the Business for Peace as a working group and its mission. Christina, to you.
That's great. Thank you, Maya, for your kind welcoming, and welcome to everyone else who's joining us today, particularly our speakers, and of course, the rest of you are participating. For those of you who are new to our working group was founded in 2014 with the aim of deepening, promoting, supporting research and understanding that the role business has to play in sustainable peace efforts with a specific focus on fragile and conflict-affected environments. Today's webinar is one of our flagship initiatives. We organize webinars every 2 to 3 months. So for those of you who are joining us today for the first time, please keep in mind that we're always on the lookout for opportunities to promote research and practical application in the space or in the field of business for peace. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Sophie Kaki from Prime, who will tell you a little bit more about Prime and how we as a working group fit within Prime's initiatives before we turn over to our guest speakers for today.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Christina. Welcome, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you. And I'm more than happy to support these webinars from the Prime Secretariat side. This is one of several that we've done so far this year. A little bit about the Principles for Responsible Management Education. Very briefly, we are an initiative of the Global Compact. And as you know, the Global Compact is in public-private partnerships. It's the biggest CSR initiative in the world, so the largest link between the private sector and the UN. And the Principles for Responsible Management Education, Prime, functions the same way, but working with business schools. So changing partnerships, curriculum, and research towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So yeah, thank you, Christina.
That's great. Fantastic. So let's kick it off then with our discussion for today. I am very pleased and delighted to introduce our first guest speaker, who I've had the pleasure of working with, Dr. Vesna Bojovic-Develovic, who is a senior research fellow, co-director of the Business and Human Security Initiative, and deputy director of conflict research program at the LSE. And before I turn it over to Vesna, I forgot to mention that throughout the discussion and the presentations, if you could please pay attention to the bottom of your screens, where there will be 3 polls that will pop up, and we'd kindly invite you to participate in those. It looks as if the first question is already on the screen. So if I could turn it over to Vesna, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. The methodology that is presented today is part of the program called Business and Human Security Initiative based at the London School of Economics. The aim is to propose a new form of collaborative governance between companies, governments, and civil society that can address an issue or shared concern in an innovative way and achieve sustainable common goal. In developing our proposal, we have applied 2 concepts: human security as a context-specific manifestation of insecurity experienced by individuals and groups which highlights the comprehensive nature of threats to everyday life and how different kinds of risk and vulnerabilities, including business risk, are interconnected. We use human security also as a methodology that enables to articulate those interconnections and to achieve shared outcomes. So from a company perspective, human security is both a goal and a way to achieve these shared objectives. And it's a way to strengthen proactive and preventative initiatives and other social actors. At the core of this concept are the relationships, mutual relationships among diverse actors, which are often strained and dysfunctional and can prevent the synergies that can be achieved by combining different actors' competencies and resources in finding innovative solutions. And resetting these complex relationships among different actors on the ground is a key challenge and the one that our proposal aims to address. Based on these two concepts of human security and multi-stakeholder partnerships, we have developed a framework which we call Human Security Business Partnership as a guidance for companies and other stakeholders on how to structure more constructive relationships that can bring about positive change with benefits for all. The framework emphasizes participatory processes for creating positive interactions between diverse stakeholders and a new type of dialogue on the basis of shared goals and interests. So, because human security business partnerships are a collaborative mechanism, they are not solely about mobilizing companies, but they depend crucially on governments, civil society, communities, and other actors working actively together with companies to try a new approach. So our goal is really in this is to get some feedback to our proposal, to test our proposal, including through conversations like the one we have today, and to ultimately apply it in diverse contexts, across the world where we have the opportunities to partner with companies. Now, the framework that you are looking at consists of three components or three interrelated pillars of principles, processes, and tools which reflect the ideas of working collaboratively towards outcomes that meet actors' interests and expectations. And each pillar applies to every type of partner or every type of stakeholder. And it's intended to bring those stakeholders together and provide a basis for effective and durable collaboration. Now, the framework that we propose is not a blueprint, is not something that is set in stone, but it will really depend the way it is applied, it's the way it's implemented, and the kind of partnerships and development and security schemes that arise out of this application will be defined by contextual specificities. But just to kind of flag where the entry points are, it can be the case of a company which is experiencing certain problems, issues that it has identified. So framework can be one way of engaging with different stakeholders to address that particular challenge. But it can be also a case of a company looking to invest into a new environment or to diversify existing operations. So clearly, from the company perspective, these are different entry points, and then added to that would be different context, so geographic context or economic context in which these partnerships may be tried. And just to finish up by saying that as I hinted initially, that we want to have different applications of this framework, and we have at the moment one pilot, which is in Colombia, where we work with UNDP and UNHCR on developing job opportunities in five territories in Colombia, and looking at also livelihood opportunities for different categories of local population. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Vesna. We look forward to hearing more from you in the discussion section. I'd like to turn the table to Mark Van Dorp and Marcel Smits. They're going to present their research paper summarizing proposals to use human security and positive peace frameworks in corporate impact measurements in FCSs. And they will set out the problem and the solutions to it. If I could turn the table over to you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And before starting, I would like to thank in particular LSE IDEAS, as well as the Institute for Economics and Peace, for providing a platform to develop our ideas. And as well, the knowledge platform Security and Rule of Law, funded by the Dutch government. So it's great to be able to present our paper here. I'd like to start by, just explaining the problem that we have been looking at, and then Marcel will turn to the solution. So starting with the first problem that we were basically encountering, this is the fact that, as you probably all know, businesses face growing public expectations and increased demands from investors, but also from other stakeholders, to contribute in a positive way to ESG outcomes, so-called environmental, social, and governance outcomes, as well as to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is not just a bonus anymore. This is something that that both shareholders and other stakeholders, like the public, are requiring from companies. And actually, there's also increasingly evidence that by doing so, you're actually also increasing your profitability as a company. Secondly, we're also seeing that companies are facing greater legal accountability, which leads to higher demands for proper ESG tracking and reporting. And this can be seen by the number of lawsuits against companies, which is increasing, but also the fact that in many countries mandatory due diligence is now becoming law, or people are discussing this to become law. And just as an example, the Netherlands is currently also debating a new law for mandatory due diligence as a binding legal framework. And of course, we have the UN binding treaty, which is under development. So, which means that companies, they will one day or the other, they will have to comply with these ESG criteria. And for the better, I would say, because it creates a level playing field for everyone, so that those who have good intentions will no longer suffer from the free riders. So the third problem is that we noted that many companies do not often measure social impact, and and instead they focus on working towards a standard that aims to minimize negative impacts, which is as an example, human rights due diligence is really focusing on minimizing and mitigating human rights risks, without really looking at how to, to improve people's life standards. So, this is something that I think is quickly developing, because there's been a lot of attention for the S in the ESG, the social issues. And my impression is that with the current pandemic, this is only increasing, because social issues, are of course things that have been more in the spotlight as a result of the pandemic. When you look at supply chains and the problems that, the increasing inequality because of economic downturn. Finally, there's of course the focus of our paper is on fragile and conflict-affected settings, as was already explained. And in those settings, based on also my experience in those countries, is that companies struggle to address the complex and dynamic reality on the ground. They're often, not well equipped or really aware of their own role as a potential actor to the conflict. And they're also, struggling more than in other situations with questions like, what is our own responsibility in case of, an absent government? What should we do for local communities and whatnot? And also, what are financially material issues? To what extent do our impacts actually translate into financial issues like increased profitability or decreased profitability? So this leads to a situation where many of these local material issues go unnoticed, leaving a false sense of security for the company. So they might have checked all the boxes in ESG standards, but still they're not doing things according to the let's say conflict sensitivity standards, but also peace promoting standards. So actually what we see is that these current guidelines do not capture the true impact and fail to address the real risks to people in fragile and conflict affected settings. And even enhanced human rights due diligence standards, in our view, that fail to capture the impact on people's human security. So just before turning to Marcel, I would like just you to look at this map, the Fragile States Index of 2020, which was actually published before the COVID-19 pandemic started. But we were already quite fragile, and I think that's only increased. If you look at the world, and you could say like everything from yellow up to dark red is more or less fragile, can be called more or less fragile. So that's basically, I would say, almost the entire world, with a few exceptions. Which means that for companies, it's really not a matter of saying that is not their problem, it's not their business. Every company will be faced with these issues, whether or not they're operating in fragile settings or whether they buy from fragile countries. And their supply chain responsibility is involved. They will have to think about how to do better in these situations, and we hope to offer some start of a solution for that. So Marcel, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. So just to recap, Mark made a point that there needs to be more focus on companies creating a positive impact, and which is partly driven by more focus on the SDGs, and essentially also by the big challenges that the world is facing today. So reducing negative impact is no longer enough, but actually moving from a risk management process to creating genuine and measurable positive impacts turns out to be quite a challenge. Positive impacts that are measured on climate change, for instance, or water consumption are often measured at a higher global levels. Think about wind turbines that make a positive contribution to energy transition, for instance, but this impact doesn't really account for the negative local effects related to the use of conflict minerals, for instance, in the production of these same wind turbines. And, think of forced displacement issues, armed conflict, violence against women, and so on. And when companies do monitor and report on local impact, for instance, around water usage in areas of water stress, they tend to look at environmental impacts locally and associated health issues. But the wider effects on food security or competitions over resources are often overlooked. And so this understanding on the links between many sustainability issues, between climate change, human rights, diversity, health, safety, and their close relationship with instability and security is fully missing in the process. And that's what we observed. Now, part of the problem is, as Mark also explains, that the corporate instruments today are often not considered, fail to capture actually these risks. And these risks are often not considered real financial risks, and therefore not financially material, and they are therefore also given a lower weight in the risk assessments of companies. Now, our research, I should say, is based on a growing consensus that sustainability issues covered by the SDGs are material for companies, regardless whether they're financial or non-financial. And we argue that these then should become part of a company's local material analysis. So what are then the issues that are material to the business activity in fragile and conflict-affected settings? Now, to identify those, we propose that the material analysis takes place from the ground up and must go beyond looking at business risks and opportunities alone. And negative impacts typically play out locally, and companies are expected to report on local impacts, for instance, through GRI standards, which do take an outward look, but reporting on localized impacts and actions taken are often incomplete when a material analysis has not picked up on either the relevance or the significance of these local issues. Also, a bottom-up analysis would reveal if issues are within the control or influence of companies. This will then give greater clarity over corporate responsibility towards communities and meet greater expectations by many socially conscious investors. Now, a local materiality assessment will not only reveal issues, but also those who are expected to be most impacted and how. Too often, stakeholders are broadly defined, which makes it difficult to decide whom to engage with. But a locally grounded analysis can guide stakeholder inclusiveness. Also, the significance of local impacts must have some sort of bearing on the level of influence of stakeholders. In other words, when a local impact that can substantively influence the assessment and decisions of stakeholders should include the voices of those who are affected most. Now, on the second slide, we talk about human security as an approach, which essentially connects security, fragility, human rights, and also development together. In the local material analysis, the risks to companies and communities, such as economic risks, environmental risks, food risks, security risks, but also political risk and violence, for instance, can be more easily identified. And they help to really inform a long-term sustainability KPIs. So by accounting for these multidimensional risks to people within the level of influence or control of the company, the ability to create positive impact increases. Now, human security offers a way to pull the E, S, and the G issues together and not miss those important connections between them, which can have such a high impact in fragile and conflict-affected settings. For instance, climate issues that cause droughts in certain areas affect people's livelihoods and are more likely to trigger further competition over resources in fragile and conflict-affected settings where often pre-existing divisions and deep-rooted inequalities between groups are already present. So those types of relationships between multidimensional risk can offer also key indications of the key thresholds to show when these risks become a threat to people's personal or a group security. So by bringing together these human elements of security, rights, and development, we present a simple methodology for localization of the SDGs to show which SDGs are most relevant to the company and give guidance on how actions taken to contribute to the SDGs can be both risk responsive and generate positive impact. On the next slide, this slide actually visualizes the various dimensions of human security and the risks within those dimensions. Now, the point that I wanted to make here with this slide is rather than to select the SDGs based on their alignment with the core business, as is not the case today, like an energy company may choose to report on SDG 7, the renewable energy goal, we propose that local risks faced by people form the starting point for reporting on possible SDG contributions. So if such an approach is applied by companies, it considers the interconnectedness between the dimensions and shows how E, S, and G are linked and can be prioritized. Now, in the case of renewable energy, this can impact poverty, food security, health, and gender equality. So all of a sudden, these SDGs contributions become tangible and multiple, whereby the human security dimensions can tell us much more about how they are connected and how these issues can be addressed. So on the next slide, we argue that humans, in our paper actually, we argue that human security and positive peace work very well together for measuring social impact by companies. So both concepts acknowledge the interconnectivity between human rights, security, and development. And positive peace, as some of you know, measures the factors that create and sustain peace in a society, or essentially the ability to absorb shocks and recover from them. So if you compare this, or look at how they work together, human security and positive peace, or where human security looks at the risks faced by people, positive peace assesses the environment to deal with those risks. So essentially, increasing levels of positive peace in a society offers more human security guarantees for people. Positive peace, therefore, serves as a good measure for a society's resilience against the threats. And because it takes a systems approach, it can be applied at different levels, national, local, in the same way. Because positive peace and ESG also highly correlate, it makes the instrument of positive peace as an instrument suitable to assess and measure the capacity for companies to deal with risks faced by people and companies. For instance, in areas where ethnic minorities face exclusion and are at higher risk of unemployment due to such exclusions that can affect their livelihoods and possibly create tensions with other groups, companies that experience this in the form of a lack of diversity in the supply chain could potentially decide to include business by minorities in their supply chain. But the success really depends on, for instance, the level of education or level of access to markets by these minority groups. These things are measured by positive peace. So depending on the circumstances and the level of influence, companies could be in a position to address human security risks directly or influence the positive peace environment around them directly or indirectly. So the last point I would like to make with this presentation is that our research shows that companies require much more collaborative solutions if they wish to track and measure their real impact on the ground. So that can be established through a more structured community engagement process in the form of human security business partnerships, which is something that is missing today. Vesna already mentioned the Human Security Business Partnership. That is an example of such an engagement process between companies, communities, and other stakeholders. Now, especially in places on the measurement part, especially in places where structured data is lacking, which is often the case in fragile and conflict affected settings, consultations and data collection by local parties will be helpful to establish the human security risks. Such a partnerships can be considered, in our view, an essential collaborative governance mechanism to determine ESG factors by the company, agree on impact indicators collectively, and validate the social impact through this mechanism. So this concludes our presentation. I'd like to thank you for listening. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Marcel. So we have another polling question. If you can go to the poll button and answer these questions, we'll be very grateful. And then we would like to move to our next speaker, which is Irina van der Sluis from ASN Bank in the Netherlands. It's one of the so-called green banks in the Netherlands for a long time. And she's actually a human rights advisor for the bank, supporting the social dimension of sustainable investments, and also the chair of the platform Living Wage Financials. So Irina, we're very happy to have you here. And please reflect on the presentation so far.
Yes, thank you, Mark. You can hear me well, right?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you all for having me on this beautiful webinar. It is a new environment for me, a new community. I have some experience with the OECD and especially the guidelines for M&Es, of course, with the whole agenda of business and human rights. But I'm very happy that you also include these issues in the academia and in education. So yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit from my experience in the financial sector around these issues. But before I talk about what the financial sector and our investee companies can do, I do want to zoom out a little bit and say one word: government. We need governments. So let's not forget that if you know a little bit about the Ruggie framework way back in 2008, but in all of this issue, when you talk about responsible business conduct, never forget that it's only one pillar. We need governments to step up more than ever in OECD countries and in non-OECD countries. Because what we're talking about today and what we've been talking about already for 20 years, I don't know, yeah, maybe even 25 years. I was a student when, you know, in the happy 90s and everything went well and it was the end of history and capitalism had won and the globalization and everybody happy. And then Shell in Nigeria and all that, and it came also to the forefront. So for 25 years, at least in my experience, we've been talking about these issues. And we've been talking about these issues because there is a governance gap. So I know this wasn't the focus of your study, but I just want to really emphasize that the reason why all these stakeholders really need to work together is because of that governance gap. And I will talk a little bit later around my view, what the OECD countries can do, but obviously also in some of the production countries where there is a lot of guidance. There is the normative framework of the ILO, of the OECD, of the UN, but it's not translated into national law, nor into enforcement of national law. So yes, so here we are. Obviously, trying to fill that gap. And Marcel and Mark, you've done a great job, and also LSE for having this as a topic on the research, because it's really important that we add on and keep on continuing in this dialogue, that you not only have that risk-based approach but also have a positive impact. And I wholeheartedly agree that we need to have a more holistic approach, because like you say, Marcel, climate, human security is all connected. And you know, last month I think David Attenborough came out with his Life on a Planet. If you haven't seen it on Netflix, go and watch it. And of course he talks for 90% about the environment and nature, but he also mentions that poverty is really a reason also that we cannot take care of ourselves properly as a human family, and so also not of our environment. So it's also all interlinked, and business has certainly a role to play. So let's talk business for sure. And in that sense, I mean, I think it was a really important communication from the UN back in 2008 to say, yes, states have the responsibility to protect human rights, if I zoom in on the S a little bit, but there is a corporate responsibility to respect. Well, the last, let's say 10, 12 years, we have seen a lot of good projects, a lot of good nudging, and a lot of good encouragement and subsidizing from all these multi-stakeholder initiatives. But to play a little bit the devil's advocate here as well, to maybe kick off the discussion, I am personally a little tired of talking. I am personally a little tired of having more of guidance and papers and frameworks. And like you guys, I want impact for sure. I have no truth in that sense. I have no, there's no panacea or you know, one solution for all these tricky problems. But from the financial side, we do want to play a pioneering part as a human rights advisor at ASN Bank, which is already, I think, a nice combination, right? To have somebody full-time working at a bank around human rights. So just maybe a few sentences on our bank, because maybe some of you on the call are not aware. A lot of Dutch people on the presenting today. So we are one of the two indeed more greener ethical banks in the Netherlands. We were founded in 1960 by trade unions who wanted to make sure that their pension fund was invested well in that sense. And 40, 50, 60 years later on, we, I think, are still on the forefront and still pioneering in that ESG field. We do that quite stringently. So we have the luxury that our business model is as such that we exclude high risk sectors. So we already, you know, before due diligence became popular, we already divested, never invested in fossil fuels, in mining, in tobacco, in weapons. So for us, that is such high risk sectors that we don't see that through engagement there's any possibility for positive change. Then also we have stringent sustainability criteria. For instance, we check possible investee companies on the 4 core labor standards of the ILO. So if they don't have that in their policy, they're not eligible for our investment universe. And then we have long-term goals, and there's where we put some effort to be a positive change. On climate, the whole bank, including our mother company, is striving not only to be climate neutral, but also climate positive. On biodiversity, no net loss. And on human rights, we identify through our salience analysis, and I hope salience is a word that you recognize of something that is also including some of the community risks. Through our salience analysis, we saw that, for instance, the garment sector is still has still a lot of risks, and for us wages is a high risk because they are still poverty wages in the garment supply chain, but it is also a potential for positive change as an enabler, as a catalyst to maybe also mitigate other human rights risks such as child labor and excessive overtime. So that's why we focused a few years ago on creating an engagement trajectory around living wages in the garment sector, and that grew out to something quite nice and big. not only from the ASN side, but also now in that platform Living Wage Financials, whereby there are 15 financial organizations, mostly Dutch, but also a few international parties, joining together to create more leverage vis-a-vis the investees. And we represent 2.6 trillion euros assets under management, which I hope gives us some leverage if we talk to those big brands. What do we do, which is maybe a little bit different, and which also got us the PRI award, the UN PRI award last year of active ownership, which I'm super proud of. So what we try to do a bit differently is to call our engagement meaningful, and meaning that we measure. So Remco will talk a little later about data that is super important, and we use data from service providers such as Sustainalytics. But in this meaningful and long-term engagement trajectory, we wanted to do our own analysis and our own research, and that's why we created our own living wage assessment that we conduct every year. And there is also assurance on the part of an external party for that. So it's quite, I hope, yeah, legit. How do you say that? It makes it more credible, I guess, if we talk then to brands to come up with our own extra investigation around living wages in supply chains predominantly. And so long term is important, especially around issues like S. We cannot, like in climate, that it's more black and white. Maybe it's more data and quantifiable. With the S, we need more qualitative feel for that. And so we have to have a longer view in that sense. The last really important thing I want to make around meaningful engagement trajectories is that you also have the courage to say at a certain point, this is the milestone we want to reach in 2 or 3 years. And if a certain investee doesn't reach that milestone, then you have several options to escalate, but also at some point to divest. And I think that makes us really strong. And I think personally that in the ESG field, if you look at the last 10, 15 years, it's coming up, PRI and all of that, principles for responsible investment, etc. But the bigger colleagues, let's say, the more mainstream institutional investors still are maybe a little bit hesitant to actually end engagement trajectories and say, okay, this is enough, this is not leading anywhere to any sustainability, so we divest. And we need also divestment, especially on high risk sectors. I will end a little bit because I realize that I'm probably over my 5 minutes, but I will end by saying that aside from our approach, Mark, is a bit more risk-based still. However, the positive impact that you rightly point out comes to the forefront when we look at that. We also want to support investees with everything that is out there. We're supporting MSIs, tools, instruments in order to make more transparent the wage gaps in these supply chains and how to bridge them. Another way I hope we contribute to some positive change is to also come out towards governments and say, okay, guys, OECD governments, it's now time to help these front runners, to help these companies that are already doing for 10, 15, and 20 years their best for their part. But now we need to level the playing field. Now we have to have a base floor that goes up and that can hopefully make a systemic change, which is super needed, because all of this, what I've seen for the past 20, 25 years, which is a bit of a disappointment, I guess, is pilot projects. And pilots are great, and best practices are great, and tools and instruments are great, but we need systemic changes now. And maybe COVID can tip the, and move the needle, but we need systemic change. And whether it's possible in this model or whether we really have to make that change from that shareholder model towards a stakeholder model, well, that's to be debated, I suppose. And for me, I hope we go towards some kind of a donut economy at some point. But until we're there, and until really it is still voluntary for most of these companies to do this stuff, well, I don't think we're going to get systemic change. So we need a smart mix of both the floor base of legislation from Brussels, and Commissioner Reinders is working on that. And on top of that, all that beautiful guidance and partnerships coming out of this work, but also many other organizations. I want to leave it at that.
Thanks a lot. I didn't want to interrupt you because it was so interesting. but we are also facing a time constraint. So I'd like to move to our next speaker. Thanks a lot, Irina. Our next speaker is Remco Slim, which actually means smart in Dutch, because he's a very smart guy. He's working for Sustainalytics, which is an ESG rating agency, and responsible for the global standard screening of the company. But he will definitely tell more about himself. Remco?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, the pressure is on to provide some clever insights, hopefully. Yeah, indeed. So we're in ESG and Sustainalytics as a research firm, we do many types of research. So while we're most well known for our ESG risk rating, we also do other types of research. For instance, global standard screening and human rights radar, which I'm involved, which is specifically focusing on fragile territories and countries. And the type of research that we do here is really for investors that are also interested in doing no harm and to do due diligence to avoid negative impacts. But a trend that we see is that we also often receive questions from investors that are eager to also to show and know and show which companies also provide positive impacts locally on the ground. And that is, of course, a huge challenge for us to also do research on. But we see also that there is this need because there's more recognition in the financial sector as well that if you can show positive impact, that this will also attract sustainable capital, and that could help you as a company to survive and to sustain and flourish. The proposal here on human security to integrate indeed is not fitting well in the traditional concept of ESG. It's not fitted within policies and programs which you measure to avoid risk, and whether you want to understand if a company is adhering to international norms. But what is a nice opportunity to explore further is to ensure that also companies see the business case and to be rewarded that if they start to measure locally bottom up, and that they also can report on that, and subsequently that investors are also able to report to their beneficiaries what impact they generate with their investments. Of course, there's already a lot of pressure on companies to report, and data collection is really expensive. So these are major hurdles, right, to come to an impact reporting framework and to have these metrics in place. And yeah, I would hope that this proposal that we can find opportunities that companies can work with stakeholders who might collect data themselves or report data themselves to the company, and that and then on top of that there's a framework in more reporting initiatives that are out there that companies can also show to their investors, like what positive impact they created with being operating in a high-risk country or fragile state. Yeah, so my final point, like Sustainalytics, we also separated like the do no harm and do good part. So we are also working currently on multiple pilot tests and frameworks ourselves called impact metrics. And also here, we started with a framework like including elements such as basic needs and human development, in which human security would fit in really well. And currently we really have a skeleton with indicators and metrics below it, but we want to build that over time when hopefully in the coming years there will be frameworks and metrics published that everyone agrees that these are measurements of positive impact, which can be used by investors to select which companies and projects are sustainable, and to meet not just like the responsibilities they already have, but also to amplify their positive impact. And yeah, that will be the challenge in the coming years to find such indicators and develop these together with local stakeholders, such as employees of the company, but also beyond that, their families and indeed together with local governments or institutions. So with that, I would like to end, to also give room to the Q&A section.
Thank you very much, Remco. So we just have another question in the poll. If you can briefly look at that in the poll function, we'd be very grateful. And I'd like to turn over to Christina for the audience debate.
Sure. So we have one question from Gemma Donnelly-Cox. She asks, what is the key distinction between business for peace and business and human rights? So if anybody would like to take a stab at that. Maybe also interesting to reiterate the point of the intersectionality of human security perspectives. And if no one wants to answer directly, it may also be an opportunity for those of you who provided remarks to maybe throw in maybe one or two last comments that you'd like to share with the group before we end the call in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I can respond to the question about what the difference is for us at Sustainalytics. So business and human rights is, in our view, about how a company meets its requirements on responsibility. So is it avoiding complicity in fragile states? Is it making sure it's not operating forced labor in a supply chain? So that is really for us the business human rights, whereas the positive aspect is more like how does a company with operation improve lives, livelihoods, living wage, incomes of locally, etc. So it's more the do good part instead of focusing on how, from the company perspective, inside out, how they prevent harm.
Yes, maybe I could add to that. I fully subscribe to your description, but I think for business in the business for peace, let's say community, one of the key things is to go beyond normal human rights due diligence towards so-called enhanced human rights due diligence, and to include things like a conflict analysis, looking at the conflict dynamics, the power dynamics, and to really look at root causes of the conflict and the role the company plays in that respect, and how the company can, go from do no harm towards playing a more positive role in hopefully in the end in resolving conflict and building peace. Although there's a lot of debate whether this should be the role of companies at all, but that's maybe food for another webinar.
And maybe I could add that the business for peace field really takes stock of a businesses or a company's internal operations, how they interact with their own workforce, how they interact with the broader labor market, and how they interact with communities and society, including government. Vesna? I think you're on mute, Vesna. Could you kindly unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. I think there is also a point about business and human rights operating more in the framework of compliance, whereas business and peace really captures this proactive empowerment dimension of company engagement. So I think this is where we believe that human security can add. Is in no way actually, if you want, it implies human rights compliance, but then it takes the whole interaction and relationship towards empowerment and positive engagement.
Marcel or Irina, would you like to add something?
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with the speakers, and I'm normally somebody who sees the glasses half full, but just to counter the contributions. In my experience, the reason I think we need mandatory human rights due diligence is because I think most companies do not yet conduct human rights due diligence compliance, period. So, or any due diligence, I mean, it's voluntary. So to jump straight to the positive impact and the role of a company in positively influencing these complicated situations in some of these environments, I don't know. Let's first build also that ground from the ground up and make sure that there is that base floor of companies actually knowing what the risks are, and indeed, like Mark says, doing their conflict analysis and then see how they can play a positive part. And of course, then as my last comment, we're talking about these guidelines and normative frameworks that most of the OECD governments encourage their companies, their multinationals to do. But what about non-OECD countries and companies? That's also a world to win there.
Marcel, would you like to jump in?
Well, here's the thing. When companies only, especially in fragile and conflict-affected settings, when they start just addressing the human rights, you actually address the manifestations of structural problems. And the problem is that it doesn't give you any guarantees, because you're not looking at what's really causing these human rights violations to take place. And so that's where human security, and that's why we need development and other aspects to build on that. So I dare to say that the human rights focus of today is incomplete. It needs to go further, and we see plenty of examples. We have seen the experiences by companies operating in conflict-affected areas and doing applying every single standard and still getting into trouble. So that's why I say that it's not enough. It's insufficient, and essentially gives you that false sense of security. I understand there are some more questions though, and we're almost running out of time.
I'm sorry to say we are out of time. It's 4 o'clock. We will collect all of the questions and the comments and share them with our speakers from today. I do apologize that the 1 hour is never enough time, and especially when we have multiple speakers. Thank you so much for joining us, Marcel, Remco, Mark, Vesna, and Irina. You can see here there are at least Marcel and Vesna's contact information. I'd like to point you to our own Prime Business for Peace Working Group's website, where we have information on our institutional partnerships. We also have an online repository of publications. We'd be happy, of course, to upload Marcel and Mark's paper so that we can more easily disseminate that to those of you who joined today. We will have our next webinar will be at the turn of the year in early 2021, where we will welcome our colleagues from the Prime Working Group on anti-poverty. And we would welcome you to join that. We're always open to organizing, to hosting folks who are working on either business for peace related topics or the role of business in fragile and conflict affected environments. So please feel free to get in touch with us. And again, thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a pleasant rest of the week. Take care.